Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. I'm Brandon Ware. You're watching Angel 65, and today this is Pink Floyd Deep Dive, Chapter 1, in which we discuss the Discovery box set, specifically the 14 studio albums. So this first chapter is going to focus less as an unboxing and a review of this product and more of a discussion of the albums itself. So it's going to be a longer video and more of a podcast style format. So preface, you can probably tell if you've seen a few of my videos by this point that I'm a massive Pink Floyd fan. Pink Floyd is one of my favorite bands of all time. I have loved them ever since I was in high school. I heard Dark Side of the Moon for the first time when I was a little kid, and I always thought it was amazing, but for some reason I never actually went back and discovered the rest of the Pink Floyd catalog until high school. And I remember the exact event that prompted it. I had an English teacher in high school who was into a lot of classic rock, and at that time I was listening to a lot of Rush, which of course Rush is also one of my faves, and Learning to Fly came on, which I remembered hearing, and I thought, wow, this is a really great song. I haven't checked out Pink Floyd in forever, and started talking to him about it, and he started giving me burned CDs of stuff by Pink Floyd. I started watching documentaries on YouTube. The original Making of Dark Side of the Moon documentary was available on YouTube in its full length, including all the bonus material at that time. This is before copyright restrictions on YouTube really got hammered into the ground, and so none of that stuff is available anymore for free anyway. But I went home, I watched that documentary, and immediately remembered how much I loved hearing Dark Side of the Moon. But this is the first time I had ever heard of the song Echoes, when they discussed that in that documentary. And immediately I was fascinated by it, and so I went out and I sought out first the Live at Pompeii version of Echoes, and then the complete version, and I listened to the entire metal album, and it absolutely blew my mind. It is one of the coolest things I had ever heard, and it is still one of the best sounding records I have ever heard in my entire life. In fact, before we get to that album as part of the overall discussion, I will say Metal by Pink Floyd is tied for one of my 3 favorite albums of all time. The other 2 being Moving Pictures by Rush and The Fragile by 9 Inch Nails. Those 3 albums have just had such an impact on me in middle and high school. And they continue to influence me in my own music, in the way I think about music, and the types of music that I seek out. I would have never discovered other bands that I've talked about on this channel, like namely King Crimson and Yes and Genesis. I would have never gone to those bands had it not been for the influence that Pink Floyd had on my life when I was in high school, and specifically that album. So ever since my sophomore year of high school, I did a deep dive into Pink Floyd then. I started buying everything that I could, and they've just continued to be a massive influence and a favorite band of mine. The truth is, I think I overplayed them in high school, so in college when I got into other progressive rock and eventually jazz, I kind of put Pink Floyd to bed for a while. And since college, there's really only been 4 albums that I go back to on a regular basis, which I don't think will surprise anyone. Those 4 albums are Metal, Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, and Animals. Those are the 4 that I go back to with frequency. I listen to all of them probably 2 to 3 times a year at the very least, and they continue to be just massive, huge focal points of my music taste. I love all 4 of those albums. To me, they're all perfect 5 out of 5 albums, and I enjoy them relentlessly. But it has been quite some time since I went through and listened to everything by Pink Floyd and done a true deep dive on them. So this weekend I went through my Discovery box set, which is the main source of my Pink Floyd studio albums. I own quite a few of these on vinyl. Some of them are the 2016 pressings of the 2011 remasters, which are what are in here. The masters were done by James Guthrie and Joel Plante at Das Boot Recording. And some of them are older pressings, just depending on what was available at the time, whenever I happened to pick them up. But it has been at least 5 to 6 years since I've gone through and listened to every single Pink Floyd album in chronological order. And I gotta tell you, it was an absolutely fascinating experience. And particularly with some of those early albums, I forgot just how much I enjoy them. They are not part of the 4 I listed, more of the classic 70s Pink Floyd period, but there was some great stuff in there. And it had been so long since I listened to some of them that I forgot some of the nuances and just forgot even how certain songs went. And so it really was like a fresh ear on a lot of this older material. So we're going to go through them one by one. First, just some thoughts on this box set itself. I'm not sure how readily available this is. I believe I bought my copy for $180 after it had been out for 5 or 6 years already. And as far as packaging and production and mastering goes, I mean, I really have nothing negative to say about it. I will say that some of the early albums, there seems to be a little bit of bass rattle on some of the older songs, which I think maybe they tried to boost the bass more than was available in the original master tapes. And on a couple of the albums, namely Ummagumma and Atom Heart Mother, I think they were not driving the tape that hard because they're mastered loudly, but the tape hiss is also very loud, which doesn't bother me. The sound of the tape hiss doesn't irritate me at all. And I almost like the fact that they didn't try to EQ it out or use some sort of computer technology to eliminate it. I think it adds a patina to the recordings, if you like. That's basically the only criticism I have of it. So for most of these albums, excluding Dark Side, Metal, and The Wall, and I guess A Momentary Lapse of Reason as well, these are the only masters of these albums that I've ever heard, and I can find nothing negative to say about them, other than there's a little bit of bass rattle on the first 5-ish albums, but not enough to be distracting or be irritating or make my speakers sound bad. Because the thing is, as I'm sure everyone watching this video would agree, Pink Floyd records, by and large, sound amazing. Pretty much from Ummagumma on, they sound phenomenal. They're recorded extremely well. They're EQ'd very well, and they're just very detailed sounding. And of course, that becomes even more true in the mid to late 70s. But yeah, basically everything from Ummagumma onwards sounds phenomenal to me in terms of its sound quality. So if you buy this, I don't think you'll be disappointed. These are all available separately. They were first released on Capitol, and then they were repackaged with basically the same exact artwork and booklet style packaging, the same 2011 remasters, and released separately one by one on Pink Floyd Records, which is how they're doing all their official stuff now. But it's the same masters and virtually identical packaging. I will say, on a couple albums, they're missing some parts of the original artwork. They're missing the inner gatefold of Ummagumma. They are missing, what else? There's no evidence of the like mechanical handshake or the black outer plastic bag on Wish You Were Here. And The Wall, the artwork is just kind of uninspiring because it includes the gatefold in the booklet, but it's just very small, and they could have maybe spaced the artwork out a little bit more because the Wall booklet is mostly just the lyrics, which all of the albums except The Wall and the Final Cut have virtually the same like typeface and style of booklet with all the lyrics printed. Those two just are a little bit different, but other than that, they all basically have the same typeface, and so to me, I don't mind that. It gives it kind of a uniform look, and most of the artwork is reproduced fairly well. I have no issues with it. Obviously, some of the other albums, they look a lot cooler in full 12-inch size, but as far as CDs go, no complaints whatsoever. And this also includes an additional booklet with some other images from Hypnosis and Storm Studios from throughout the years designed for Pink Floyd, and that's a nice little added bonus. Not a buying point, but certainly a cool little booklet to look at. So the box set itself, I mean, I can't give it anything less than a 5 out of 5. I mean, to me, it seems like a perfect packaging of the Pink Floyd albums. It's a nice box, the artwork is well done, and the sound quality is phenomenal. So they didn't take so many liberties with their mastering that they sound wrong, and they didn't take so many liberties with the album artwork that it looks unrecognizable or anything like that. So if you don't own all 14 Pink Floyd albums and would like physical copies of them, then the Discovery box set is a great way to get them all in a single hit. So now that we've got that out of the way, the box itself is great, masters sound great, got no issues with them whatsoever. Then we'll discuss the albums, starting at the very beginning with The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. So Pink Floyd's debut record after their first two singles, See Emily Play and Arnold Lane, which sadly are not included anywhere in this box set, which is fine, but The first album, so the original lineup of the band: Syd Barrett, Roger Waters, Rick Wright, and Nick Mason. And this is in the heart of the London psychedelic movement, 1967. As I said, I hadn't gone back to this in quite some time, and it was a lot of fun to listen to again and just really enter that surrealistic, dreamy world that the Pink Floyd inhabited at that time. As far as psychedelic music goes, I tend to not be a big fan of that, especially West Coast psychedelia from America. Anything that's associated with hippie movement and Haight-Ashbury just rubs me the wrong way, as I've said in other videos about other bands. But this English psychedelia is incredibly different. It's a lot more surreal, a lot less hippie, and their songs are all very story-based, and then of course there's some improvisation in there as well. You get Interstellar Overdrive, which is just a 10-minute epic improv that starts and ends with a very simple rock riff, and then there's all kinds of weird space sounds and stuff in the middle, which, depending on if you're in the mood for it or not, it's either really cool and really spacey, or it is a bit of a sonic mess. It just depends on what your thoughts are with that, but I really enjoy it. My favorites on Piper at the Gates of Dawn. I've always loved Matilda Mother and Chapter 24. I think those songs are just so cool. I love the mix. I love the organ sounds in them. And I particularly love Matilda Mother when Rick Wright and Syd Barrett harmonize at the end. I just thought their voices complemented each other so well. And I loved that you get a lot of Rick Wright's voice on this album, because later on in their career it became less of an important factor, and Gilmour and then especially Waters really took over there. So depending on what you think of that, it could be a plus or a minus, but overall I consider Piper at the Gates of Dawn one of their essential records. That is absolutely essential listening. It gives you just a great summary of where the band started and what their initial sound was like, and the direction that, maybe they would have moved had Syd had a better state of mental health and they could have continued with him. But sadly, that wasn't the case. They brought David Gilmour in to play live, and the initial thought was that perhaps it could be like a Beach Boys situation where Gilmour would perform live with the band, but they would retain Syd as kind of the behind-the-scenes songwriter on the records, as was done for Brian Wilson when he had some mental health struggles in the mid-60s. It didn't work out that way, so Syd is present on, I think, 3 tracks on the album, including Jug Band Blues, which is the final track, and it's just a haunting melody, especially the ending, and I think it was very profound that they would put that as the last track on the album. I do think it was probably a very intentional goodbye to Syd and a hello to the next era. Very big development on this record. So there's still a lot of the surrealism there, particularly in Rick Wright's 2 compositions, which are Remember a Day and Seesaw. Very childlike, surreal, dreamy quality to those 2 tracks. You get more aggressive with Corporal Clegg. You get maybe what's the key song of that transitional period of Pink Floyd, which is Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun. Very space rock, has kind of an Eastern scalar sound to it. Very important, and a piece that they would develop live quite a bit, obviously. You also get David Gilmour's voice introduced on the opening track, Let There Be More Light, which I really like. Overall, I don't think it's as strong an album as The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. I enjoyed it less, but I still consider it a really cool album and a really good piece of transitional music where you see where they've been and where they're going. Particularly, I think probably the most important track on the album is the title track, A Saucer Full of Secrets, where as opposed to just being this extended jam, which is what Interstellar Overdrive was on the first record, it's more of a pre-planned piece where there's still obviously a lot of improvisation happening, but it's got 4 distinct sections, and the final section, called Celestial Voices, with the organ block chords and the harmonized vocals, is just gorgeous. The first 8 or 9 minutes of the track, I'm never too sure about it. Sometimes I like it, sometimes I think it is a bit of a mess. a lot of squealy, noisy sounds that I don't think are as tastefully executed as they would be on, well, metal for sure, but maybe even some stuff before that. But it's a big build up to that closing section, which has a very big, epic, triumphant sound to it. And I've always just loved the way those block chords work on that section. So A Saucer Full of Secrets, I'm also going to consider a pretty essential release because it's the biggest indicator of the transition that took place. Sid is gone, David is in. You hear kind of the dark side of Syd Barrett on Jug Band Blues, but you also hear this space rock sound kind of develop that they would sort of develop live for the next couple years before they really find their footing on metal. So that's A Saucer Full of Secrets. Not as good as Piper, but still an essential listen. Can't say the same for More, soundtrack from the film. When we go into other chapters in this series, specifically when I talk about the early years box set, I'll talk about the film itself because I do find the film very interesting. But the soundtrack music, I like the first side a lot. Some of the songs that are on that first side came from a piece that they were developing live at that point and were not necessarily intended specifically for that film, but they're recorded really well. I've always liked Green is the Color, Cymbeline, and Crying Song a lot. I've always thought those are really cool tracks. I think Gilmour's voice on this album is phenomenal. He's really integrated himself into the band at this point. And you're even starting to hear him develop some of his leads on this. It's not as prevalent as would be on Atom Heart Mother and Metal, but you're starting to hear him develop as a lead guitarist and sort of insert himself more into the overall direction of the sound, even though a lot of the songs are still credited to Roger Waters. That's about all I have to say on that one. I don't dislike it, but it's certainly never been a favorite, and hearing it again for the first time in years, I was warmly fond of some of the songs, which I hadn't listened to in quite a while, but I don't see myself really going back to it outside of the context of a Floyd deep dive. And then we get to what is probably the strangest, most difficult, and most curious Pink Floyd album of their entire career, which is Ummagumma. Comprised of two halves. The first half is a live album, and I really enjoy the live recording section. I really like how they extend Astronomy Domini. I enjoy the live version of Careful with That Axe, Eugene. I think the live versions they did are a lot better than the studio single version that they did. I would say I probably prefer the Pompeii version from a couple years later. I think that sounds more ominous and interesting when they take it at a slower tempo versus the version on Ummagumma, which is really fast. As I said, on Saucerful, they do set the controls for the Heart of the Sun quite a bit live, and you get to hear that. And I really like A Saucer Full of Secrets. Again, I prefer the Pompeii version from a couple years later at the slower tempo, but you get to hear how they did it live, and they turned that ending block chord section into less of a kind of a church choral thing and into more of a rock piece where Gilmour just has this lovely vocal melody improvisation on top of the chord changes, which is really cool. It sounds a little bit forced here. It doesn't sound as melodic and enjoyable to listen to, frankly, as the Pompeii version, but you hear that development taking place. So the live half of this, I think, is great, and I think the live half is probably pretty essential, because it's the only official live document from that period, pre anything that ended up on early years or streaming platforms, etc. At that time, it was the only official live document of the band, and would remain the only official live document of the band in audio-only form until Momentary Lapse of Reason and Pulse. Of course, Pompeii came a couple years later, but that at the time was just a film and not a soundtrack. The studio side. Interesting concept where each band member takes half a side to develop their own kind of piece, and it's hit or miss. I find it a very difficult listen. It doesn't flow as nicely as you would hope, and the four pieces are very disparate, which on the plus side gives you a lot of variety, but on the downside they don't really sound like Pink Floyd pieces, any of them, to me. Sisyphus, which is Richard Wright's piece, which opens the disc, is interesting. I certainly love the Mellotron on it, but again, a lot of that noise, weird improv stuff happening, similar to Saucer Full of Secrets. in the third and fourth sections, which I'm not super keen on. It just doesn't sound as musical as I prefer. Roger's pieces, Grantchester Meadows, I enjoy that one a lot. I think that's a beautiful song. Again, that came from the live piece that they were developing in '69 and wasn't specifically intended for a studio album, but I think Roger does a really nice version of it. I think his double track vocal sounds really good. He's not forcing his voice, he's using his lower register. It sounds really relaxed, which I think is the goal. His second piece, though, several species of small furry animals gathered together in a cave and grooving with a pict. Not a fan. I appreciate that it was an important developmental piece for them. The start of them using tape loops and sound effects, which of course they would take to its absolute climax on Dark Side of the Moon, but I just don't think it's very musical. I get that it's supposed to be humorous. I don't find it funny. I find it really annoying, honestly. That's just my opinion. The standout of all the band members is, unsurprisingly, Gilmour's piece, The Narrow Way, parts 1, 2, and 3, which part 3 again came from that live piece, and it was just developed with an acoustic intro and kind of a more heavy rock middle section. I like his the most. It sounds most like a song, and the slide guitar stuff on it is really great. Lovely acoustic sounds. I've always enjoyed it. Again, they're relying a bit too much on the squealy treble stuff, which I don't love, but it's okay. And then Nick Mason closes the album with the Grand Vizier's Garden Party, which is interesting. It's kind of a percussion solo, but it's, again, using tape loops and stuff, repeated sections, and weird mixing techniques. It's less of a solo that's like develop melodic and rhythmic ideas in the sense of a traditional drum solo. It's more of just a percussion feature with lots of weird stuff happening, but it's okay. Overall, I like Ummagumma's live half a lot. The studio half, not as keen on it. It's a record that I'm just not that interested in. I've been tempted to pick it up on vinyl for a long time, but the 2016 pressings go for upwards of $40, which is just not an amount I'm willing to pay for a record that I only see myself regularly coming back to half of it and not all of it. But the live half is great. Certainly check out the live half. And then we get to the most esoteric sidestep of any band I can think of, which is Adam Heartmother, where the band has decided to incorporate a orchestra and choir, and they've co-composed the piece with Ron Geeson. On the Early Years box set, there's some really interesting versions of that, both with and without the orchestra. Overall, I've always enjoyed Adam Heartmother, and I will say, the album cover gives the album such a strong identity. Had they chosen to do something that was a lot more serious and seemed more profound, I think the album would come across as extremely pretentious. But I think having the cow on the front cover really gives it an air of humility and humor, which I enjoy. I think it really helps the album seem like it's not taking itself that seriously. And at the same time, it's one of the most experimental and daring records that they ever did. Does the piece work as a cohesive whole? Not necessarily, but I enjoy it, and I do think the choir adds something to it, even if most of what they're saying is nonsense and just kind of silly. They're definitely developing their jam sense as well, not just making a bunch of noise and smashing gongs and stuff, but actually like kind of jamming musically, particularly in the Funky Dung section, which I think is a real precursor to what we're going to hear on Echoes and Dark Side of the Moon following this. Overall, I enjoy it. I like Adam Heartmother. I like the second side too. I think, again, it's like a condensed Ummagumma where each band member kind of gets to develop their own ideas. So you get If by Roger Waters, another acoustic piece that's not too dissimilar from Grantchester Meadows, but a better lyrics, better vocal performance, and you get some of Gilmour's lead work on it. Summer 68 by Richard Wright, which is probably one of my favorite tunes that he did with the band. I think it sounds really cool. And what I consider one of the most important songs in Pink Floyd's history is Gilmour's Fat Old Son. It's a beautiful, lovely track, but the reason I think it's important is because although he's taken solos before this, This is really the first song in the catalog where you hear him really develop as a lead guitarist. So he takes an extended solo at the end of this and is really developing a lot of melodic ideas and is just starting to use a lot of those classic Gilmour bends that we know and love him for. He's really coming into his own as a lead player and integrating his lead style into the band, and it sounds phenomenal. And of course, you get to hear him develop as a vocalist as well. He's singing in falsetto for most of it. It's not the most powerhouse performance, but that vibe totally fits the vibe of the overall song. So Fat Old Son is far and away my favorite track on the album. I think it's lovely. I enjoy the solo very much, and I think it's a beautiful piece. The ending piece, Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast, that was on one of the early mix CDs that English teacher gave to me in high school. And yeah, it's pretty jarring. I don't know what to say about it. Again, the humorous aspect of it I can appreciate. And when the band is actually playing, it does sound like music. It doesn't sound like they're making just a bunch of noise. So there are some cool little song ideas in there. I think the dialogue and whatnot is obviously a precursor to what's coming on Dark Side of the Moon, but it's done less tastefully and more for dramatic effect as it is on that album, and done more just for a humorous effect, which is fine. It works, but not my favorite of their like extended pieces. But overall, Atom Heart Mother is another one that I would consider pretty essential. So far the essential ones that I think you must check out: Piper, Saucer Full of Secrets, the live half of Ummagumma, and Atom Heart Mother. Just because Atom Heart Mother shows them at their most ambitious, really. It's probably their most ambitious album in terms of combining these orchestral and choral effects and tape sound effects with a band performance, with some sections for improvisation that are less based on noise and more based on actual melody and rhythmic ideas, and just really trading off of each other. The interaction between Gilmour and Wright on this album is a big precursor to what comes next on Metal. Where to start with this? I think it is their first true masterpiece, and as I said in the opening, it is tied for one of my 3 favorite records of all time. I think Metal is an absolute behemoth of an album, and it is just fantastic from the very opening track, One of These Days, which is certainly the most aggressive opening to any album they've ever had. Probably even more aggressive than In the Flesh on The Wall 8 years later. Is fantastic. The double track basses, Gilmour's singing is really developed by this point. His slide guitar work on A Pillow of Winds is absolutely beautiful. And then we get Fearless, which is probably the strongest lyric that Roger has written to this point. Just about, criticism and things like that, and just not being afraid to be yourself, which they weren't on this record. I enjoy Saint-Tropez. Again, I like Roger's performance on that. I think it's very relaxed, and it's kind of a pastiche song, which I enjoy. A lot of people say they hate Seamus. I don't hate it. I think it's great. I think it's fun to have a little bit of humor before you come to the big, epic masterpiece, which is Echoes, which is just mind-blowing. Every second of that song is absolutely mind-blowing. I love it I love it so much. It gets me so excited every time I hear it. It maybe doesn't have the emotional arc that they would explore on Dark Side of the Moon, but just the way the different sections of it integrate together. Again, Gilmour's lead playing, the interaction between Gilmour and Wright in the funky jam section that starts at 7 minutes and goes to about 11 and a half is just unreal. I mean, at this point, they don't sound like 4 musicians trying to integrate themselves into each other's style. They really do sound like a band, like they're performing together, and they're listening to each other, and they're allowing moments to take shape based on what each other is doing. I just love the sound of that section where the drums have ADT and they split into wide stereo. You get a very simple bass line that just has this kind of simple funk rock element to it, and then just the trading of lead phrases between Gilmour and Wright is absolutely phenomenal, as is their shared lead vocal. Their 2 voices just complement each other so well, and I do think it's an indication that there was a loss when Richard Wright, his voice became less dominant in the band on future records, pretty much from Wish You Were Here onward. I do think they lost something when they lost his voice being a contributing factor, and particularly when he's singing with Gilmour. Their two voices just blend beautifully. The sound effects section in the middle with the whale call, whatever you want to call it, I guess they got that sound by plugging in Gilmour's wah pedal backwards. You could argue it goes on a bit too long, and it's probably the least musical part of the entire record, but again, it doesn't bother me. I enjoy it. I think that section is just ripe with sonic richness and gives you really this eerie feeling, and just the fact that it does go on a bit and sounds very eerie and disturbing means that when they finally do come back in with that 12/8 climax and Gilmour does his little lead, the arpeggios, it just, that moment when it finally comes back in and the full band is at full swing leading into that final verse, it's just beautiful. And the climax through 3 repetitions of the riff section and then into the sort of denouement, if you like, with the little voice effect where they're all singing and it sounds like it's going up in pitch, the sonic illusion. It's just a brilliant way to end it. It combines positivity with eeriness, with musical phrasing that is just superb, and I think it's one of the finest moments in rock history, not just Pink Floyd history. I still absolutely adore it, and I enjoy it every time I hear it. Echoes is phenomenal. Metal is my favorite Pink Floyd album, and the first side is great too. Absolutely essential listen. In fact, if it's one that you haven't heard, then I suggest it's the first one you go to. It's the first one I went to after having heard Dark Side of the Moon, and maybe that's part of the reason why I still love it so much, but I do find it one of their absolute best records and one of my favorite records of all time. Metal is absolutely phenomenal, and to me it just sounds as amazing as the first time I heard it. I love the mixing and the sonic quality of the entire record. I think it's a masterpiece, I really do. That leads us to another sort of sidestep, which is Obscured by Clouds. So post Pompeii and whatever, Pink Floyd is already working on Dark Side of the Moon. The piece is already being road tested. It's been in recording. They take a little break to go record another soundtrack for Barbet Schroeder, his movie La Vallée, and Obscured by Clouds. I don't think it's as significant a work as the two on either side of it, but I still really like it. I think it's got some really cool songs on it. And again, another record that I really enjoy the sonic quality of. Again, I love the blend of Gilmour and Wright's voices on the album, particularly on Burning Bridges. And I think Stay, which is Richard Wright's music, I'm going to assume Roger probably wrote the words, is great. I like that song a lot. The only song on it I'm not sure about is the closing track, Absolutely Curtains. It's kind of this ambient piece with cymbal rolls and timpani sounding things or whatever. And then it just transitions into this chant, which I can't remember if that's in the movie or not. If it has anything to do with Papua New Guinea, I don't know. But I don't know. I don't like it that much. It just sounds like a weird way to end the album. But overall, I still like Obscured by Clouds. Certainly not an essential listen, but the tracks that I recommend you go check out on it are the Gold It's in the, What's the Deal, Burning Bridges, and especially Childhood's End, because again, Gilmour is really developing himself as a vocalist and a lead guitarist, and you get that in waves on that track, and it's great. I enjoy that a lot, and I think his lyrics are great, which we'll talk more about lyrics once we get to the 80s, but yeah, Obscured by Clouds, worth a listen. Not a significant work of theirs, more of a sidestep, kind of a commissioned piece, but still has some really good songs on it. And then we get to what is there to say about the Dark Side of the Moon that hasn't already been said. I won't spend too much time on it because I really don't think I have anything new to add about this album. Why is it so ubiquitous? Why are people still talking about it up to 50, almost 55 years later? Because it is the gold standard for how to produce and mix a record. It just is. It is probably the greatest sounding record that has ever been made, other than like The only things that I can think in the rock world that give it a run for its money are like Asia by Steely Dan. The mixing and the performances and the songwriting on that is just phenomenal. And in many ways, that's an album that's closer to my heart. But when it comes to actual just sonic experimentation and just a record that sounds as perfect now as it did the day it was finished being mixed, Dark Side of the Moon is the gold standard. It is just perfect. Every single second of the album is perfect. The engineering by Alan Parsons, the mixing by Chris Thomas, the performances, the lead guitar, especially on Time and on Money, which is, that still gives me chills. The backing voices, the vocal performance of Claire Torrey on The Great Gig in the Sky, the sound effects, the voices saying random phrases in the back that just add this eerie, humorous quality to it. It's perfect. Start to finish, it is absolutely perfect. There is no way you can pick apart that record and say, well, they could have done this differently, they could have done that differently, this song isn't as good as such and such song. There is no criticism, no valid criticism that anyone could ever make of that album. None. None whatsoever. It is perfect. Absolutely perfect. It is the most perfect rock record I can think of. So you may be wondering, well, why don't you like it as much as Metal? Well, it's in the top 3 for sure, but I don't know, Metal just speaks to me more because the band itself gets to stretch out a little bit more, and I do like that it's still a developmental record and is really a stepping stone to Dark Side of the Moon. But Dark Side of the Moon, I mean, it's one of the biggest selling albums of all time for a reason. And it's not just the cover, though the cover artwork is phenomenal, and just what an iconic image, right? But the music itself is every bit as deserving of constant recognition, and I can't imagine anyone watching this video would not have heard it, but if you haven't heard it, then what are you doing? It's perfect. It's absolutely perfect record. Is it their crowning achievement? In many ways, yes. Even though it's not my personal favorite, I can admit that Dark Side of the Moon is the most perfect record that they ever did. More on lyrics. So Roger Waters has written all the lyrics, as he will for the next 4 albums, and I think what makes these the best lyrics he's ever written are the fact that they are very simple, very relatable, and yet they still have a profound quality to them. I mean, especially Time, just the way those lyrics are executed and the way Gilmour sings them, the way he gets really aggressive on that second verse. One day closer to death. It's genius. It's absolutely genius. Whatever it was that he stumbled onto when he wrote those lyrics that are just so, it just has such a simple but endearing, relatable quality. I think this is the best example of lyricism in Pink Floyd's history for sure, and they hold up as well now as they ever have. As far as Rogers Redux version of Dark Side of the Moon, I haven't checked it out. I don't plan to check it out. I've heard a lot of bad things about it. I've heard some good things about it, but I just don't see the point. I don't know why you would want to tamper with history in that way. And don't worry, there's a lot more horrible things about Roger coming, but he gets a couple more albums worth of grace before that happens. Yeah, so, oh man, I hope I haven't caused anybody to switch off now. Dark Side of the Moon, perfect record. The surround sound mix and the Atmos mix, if you can check them out, check them out. There's no better record I can think of that lends itself to the surround sound format than Dark Side of the Moon. It was just made for it. I mean, they did a quad mix at the time, and the quad mix is available in the Immersion box set. But particularly Guthrie's 5.1 mix from 2003, first released on SACD and then re-released in a variety of formats since then. Just mind-blowing. It's probably only the second or third record I ever heard mixed in surround sound, and as far as I'm concerned, it's still the best. I've heard some other fantastic surround sound mixes of albums, but none of them just lend themselves to that style of mixing as well as Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd. Alright, absolutely essential record. Of course it is. It's one of the greatest rock records ever made, and it is perfect in every single sense of the word. I can think of nothing derogatory to say about it in any way whatsoever. Perhaps it has overshadowed other parts of their career, which some people have argued is why they don't like it as much. And yeah, I suppose that's true. I mean, well, there's not that many metal shirts that you can go buy in a Walmart, right? But there's a reason people are still talking about it. And it's because it's absolutely perfect. It's phenomenal. It's the gold standard for production, mixing, and songwriting, as far as I'm concerned. Let's move on to Wish You Were Here, which is very, very, very close second for me behind Metal. And it's an album that it's one of the four that I mentioned at the start, but I actually don't go back to it as often as I do the other three, because for me this album has some emotional things attached to it. This was my grandfather's favorite Pink Floyd album, and we shared a love of this album. We actually went to go see Brit Floyd together. Sadly, my grandfather passed away about 2.5 years ago, and so this album has a lot of emotional attachment to him for that reason. And they played the title track at his funeral, and I'm going to pause right now because I can already feel myself getting very emotional talking about it, but it's phenomenal. I think it's another record that just, if you can experience it on vinyl and in surround sound, it's worth it in both ways. If I had one criticism of it versus Dark Side of the Moon, which is perfect, even though I like Wish You Were Here more personally, it's just that you start to hear some of that cynicism seep in to the lyrics of Have a Cigar and Welcome to the Machine, but I think they're still relatable enough that they're still enjoyable listens. And you could argue he's biting the hand that feeds, but I suppose he also had a right to, given that he was in that situation with the band. That's all. That's the only thing I could say about it. I think Shine On You Crazy Diamond is beautiful. I know it's written about Syd Barrett. It doesn't make me think about Syd particularly. It makes me think about my grandfather, which my grandfather didn't have any mental illnesses or anything. It's just musically, I relate that song to him. And particularly I think the climax of the album is the transition from Wish You Were Here into the recapitulation of Shine On. And particularly when Gilmour's slide solo kicks in. That to me is just absolute sublime right there, and it did make me very emotional listening to it again for the first time in some time. Again, just that moment of the record always absolutely hits me hard every single time. Of course, it's an essential record. It's beautiful, and for me, for emotional attachment, and because I really enjoy just the overall flow of it, it is a close second behind Metal for me, with Dark Side of the Moon probably coming in third place as my top 3 Floyd records. 100% essential. The artwork is brilliant. The songwriting is brilliant. Again, there's lots of opportunities to hear the band stretch out on it, particularly on the second half of Shine On. Dick Perry's sax work is amazing. Roy Harper's vocal on Have a Cigar is phenomenal. I never understood why Roger said he doesn't like it. I think Roy Harper is the definitive version of that performance, and I love it. I think it's great. Yeah, 100% essential record. Absolutely gorgeous. 5 out of 5, no question about it. Then we move on to Animals, and this is one that, again, it's one of the 4 that I regularly come back to, but I do have mixed feelings on it. It used to be a record that I very much lyrically related to when I was in high school and just had a rebellious kind of attitude. As I've gotten older, I find I relate to it less, with particularly Pig's 3 Different Ones being the biggest culprit. I think it's still totally palatable, I think, because he's not mentioning names, even though he's clearly got some people in mind that he's writing about who are these 3 pigs. But overall, I think it's still relatable enough that it doesn't sound too dated or irritating to listen to. I'm actually going to pause and take a quick break at this time. Alright, we're back, and we're still on Animals. As I was saying, I don't particularly love the lyrics on Pig's 3 Different Ones, or I don't mind the verses and choruses on Sheep. I do dislike the middle section, the spoken word section, where he's kind of making fun of Christianity. That bothers me. I take personal offense to that. even though I wouldn't necessarily refer to myself as a Christian. I think that was in very bad taste. I think it's an indicator of what's to come with Mr. Waters, and I think it's a good indication of why people really don't like him right now, and they're justified in not liking him. But enough on that. Even though most of the material is written by him, the standout track is, of course, the collaborative track with Gilmour, which is Dogs. The lead work on it is just some of his best, particularly the main solo leading into the When You Lose Control section is one of my top 3 Gilmour solos of all time. It is just perfect, absolutely gorgeous phrasing, and the pick squeals in there, or the pinch harmonics, just phenomenal. And his vocal on it is great, and I do think the fact that Gilmour still has a heavy hand in the overall sound of this record is really one of the things that saves it and still keeps it as one of their essential listens, I would say. Overall, it's still a great record, and I highly recommend you check it out. I love that the band has time to stretch out on each of the 3 epic pieces, and I do like that it opens and closes with Pigs on the Wing 1 and 2. I do think Roger's acoustic performance and vocal is really honest and poignant. I enjoy that. I think it's a good opening and closing to the record, and overall it's great. Of course, the album cover is probably my favorite of the Pink Floyd album covers. I just love the pig. I think it's great. James Guthrie's 2018 mix of it was a welcome change. I don't think it was particularly necessary. I don't think it's such a dramatic change that it merits replacing the original. It's just an interesting alternate way to hear the album. The surround mix was great, and then just last year they released the Atmos Blu-ray, and in Atmos it really takes off, particularly the synth effects sound great in Atmos. As far as their spatial audio goes, it's another classic album, and it sounds great with spatial audio. And it's, like I said, the last one that I come back to frequently. And I'm also going to assert right now that I think this is the last album that really sounds like a Pink Floyd album in their category. I think this is the last album where you get enough of Gilmour and of Waters that it sounds like a true collaboration, even if most of the work is credited to Waters. And although Richard Wright's voice is not very present, you still get a lot of his great keyboard work on it, which really saves it from the problem I think the next album suffers. So let's move on to The Wall, which is one that I initially liked a lot, and I find as I go back to it that I like it less and less each time. I think the concept is cool. I think the story is really interesting. I like that you still get a good balance of Gilmour and Waters, and obviously Comfortably Numb is outstanding, probably their crowning achievement in terms of an individual track. It's right up there with Echoes for me, and Time. Those are probably my top 3 when it comes to Pink Floyd. I think there's too much Waters on it. I think it's too much his project. It doesn't necessarily sound like a group project. At this point, Richard Wright is fired from the band and is only present as a session musician and then as a touring musician, but is not technically considered an official member. I feel like he probably had little to no input on the album. Also probably true of Nick Mason. And that's why I say I don't think it sounds particularly like a Floyd album. It sounds like a Waters project with Gilmour advising and helping it sound like a completed album. And of course Bob Ezrin providing tons and tons of direction to it as well. The strings are great. The story is interesting. Don't love Roger's voice on most of it, but I certainly prefer it a lot to what comes after. But we'll stick with The Wall for a minute. Hearing the backstory, particularly on that Immersion box set, hearing a lot of Roger's demos and then seeing his version of it live. I never went to the official tour, but I saw the DVD he did of that, and just getting a vibe for what it might have been like when Pink Floyd did it live, actually building the wall, etc., etc. All makes it interesting and makes it a fascinating piece of musical theater, almost. A rock opera, if you like, although I guess technically not, because there is spoken dialogue in it, so it doesn't qualify as only operatic, right? Darren Locke is a channel I watch a lot, and he said as much in his video. I think it's really hard to relate to the main character. Even though the first side sets him up as someone who's been traumatized by both school, the death of his father, and his overprotective mother, by the time you get to side 2 and he's abusing his girlfriend, and by side 4 he's become a full-on drug-addicted fascist, I don't feel like you feel for the character very much. Now, I'm going to admit now, I've never seen the film. I purchased it for the first time to do for my deep dive when I get to a chapter on the Wall immersion box set. I'm also going to include the film in that and watch the film and share my thoughts there. So maybe the film will give me some insight behind some of the intention and make me empathize with the character more. But I think that's the album's biggest flaw, is that the character is not someone you empathize with, and that's why I would consider this like a far inferior piece to some other classic double concept albums like well, I mentioned the Fragile, 9 Inch Nails. I realize the character is really just a hyperbolic version of Trent Reznor himself, but the fact that everything is coming from him, I think, makes it a very relatable album, as is the Downward Spiral. I think Tommy is a better rock opera than this. I think The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is better than this, even though that album is arguably very bloated and has some moments that are not as strong as Genesis' best work. It's still, you relate to the character, even though that character clearly has a troubled past as well. I just think those are all better examples of it. And this really leads me into where we're at now in the chronology, which is Rick Wright's gone, it's 1983, Roger Waters is basically in complete control of the band, and we have the final cut. It is an absolute fucking abomination of an album. I really believe that. It is one of the worst albums I have ever heard in my entire life. I despise every fucking second of it. Those are my 2 F-bombs for the video. I absolutely hate it. I think it is a garbage record. There is no redeeming qualities about it whatsoever. And this is what I mentioned earlier when I said let's talk about lyrics. I know in the 80s there's a lot of criticism, and Roger still maintains this, that he's a better lyricist than Gilmour, and that's the biggest thing the band lost once he departed, and that is bullshit. Gilmour's lyrics that he contributed with either on his own or with his wife on his solo work and on Division Bell and A Momentary Lapse of Reason are far, 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 far superior to anything on the final cut. There is almost no bar for comparison because the lyrics are so terrible, and the performance makes it even worse. Roger's whiny, annoying, crying, helpless little vocal performance on this, and his shouting when his voice is clearly not designated for shouting, he is not a shouting singer, it is just almost, it is unlistenable. It is absolutely awful. And I did listen to it again for this deep dive. I already knew I disliked it, but every time I come back to it, which, I mean, this is probably the first time I've listened to it in 5 years or more, I always want to believe I'm going to give this a fair shot, and I'm going to try to get into it and empathize with Roger here, his emotions, and just like his political thoughts, most of which I disagree with anyway, but I'm going to really try to empathize with him here and just to see what he thought, because there's multiple competing versions of stories around this. You know, really, he might have just been trying to save the Pink Floyd name. That's giving him the benefit of the doubt because Gilmour and Mason were basically inept at this point. Rick Wright's gone. His coke addiction led him out of the band. Yeah, so maybe in the best possible light, Roger is just trying to do a concept that sort of is a follow-up to The Wall to save Pink Floyd and keep the band from falling apart entirely. That's the devil's advocate argument. The more likely situation is Roger has taken complete control. He has Gilmour and Waters there because he fully recognizes that, Gilmour and Mason there because he fully recognizes that an album on his own is not going to be nearly as successful as something that has the Pink Floyd name on it, but this is his album, and it is an absolute shit show of a record. I hate every second of it. I really tried to be forgiving when I came into it this time. Put it on. Immediately, my first thought is, oh, wow, I forgot. This record does sound really good. The sound quality, the drum sound is huge on it. I really love the mixing quality of it. But by the end of the second track, I'm already like, yep, I remember why I absolutely despise this record. And so I'm making a vow here and now on YouTube to never, ever, ever, ever listen to it again. Regardless of whether I'm deciding to do a deep dive into Pink Floyd, this is a chapter that's completely skippable and should be skipped. I think it is just an absolute stain on the legacy of Pink Floyd, and it is an abomination of a record. I will say right here and now, I am not a Roger Waters fan. I am a Pink Floyd fan. And this does not have any of the qualities of a classic Pink Floyd record. Even Gilmour's lead work is very uninspired in the few occasions where you do hear it. Michael Kamen's strings, well, the songs themselves are so poorly written and poorly composed and are so boring that the strings cannot possibly add anything to it that would help make it sound like a good record. This epic piece that I believe Roger Waters probably thought it was at the time. The vocals are by far its worst quality. He is not singing well at all on this. There's parts where he's just completely out of tune, to be frank. And the spoken word stuff, it's garbage. It's an absolute garbage record. And if you disagree with me on this one, I will say you are wrong. You are wrong. There are no redeeming qualities to the final cut. It is the worst rock record I ever put myself through the torture of listening to without giving up on it. I considered it. I sat there for the whole 46 minutes and really considered giving up on it by the third or fourth track and saying, yep, nope, I'm just not going to do it. But I sat myself through it, and I gave it my full attention, and I hate it even more because of that. I absolutely despise it. I don't know how this doesn't go down in history as one of the worst records ever made. When it comes to the annals of prog rock, to the extent that Pink Floyd is even still a prog band at this point in their history, or ever were, it depends on how you define that word. I don't know. Everyone points to Love Beach by ELP being like the worst prog rock album ever. Well, I'll tell you what, if there's a gun to my head and I have to pick one to listen to for eternity, I'm picking Love Beach every time. I would pick Calling All Stations by Genesis over this every time. I would pick Tormato by Yes over this every single time. I would pick 90125 and Big Generator over this. Those are actually really good sounding records with good songs on them that are enjoyable to listen to. The final cut is an absolute nightmare of a recording. Horrible, 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 horrible album. Let me tell you what I really think. Yeah, I despise it. I absolutely despise it. And I think this is an absolute indication of why Roger Waters, especially now that he's doubled down on a lot of his beliefs, which I'm not going to go into specifically because this is a music show, not a political show, he just comes across as one of the most unlikable celebrities on the planet. He really does. And I don't feel for him at all. I think all the criticism and the defamation lawsuits he's going under right now, he deserves every bit of it. He is just not a likable person, and he is not half as smart as he would like to believe he is. End of topic. Roger's gone. We move on to 87. Gilmour's clearly in charge. The next album is arguably not very much of a Pink Floyd album either, but compared to the bullshit that we just encountered on the final cut, it is an absolute godsend by comparison. A momentary lapse of reason. One of the records that I really like, and I still, although I don't go back to it as the four records from the classic period that I named, I still really enjoy it. And if there's one good thing I can say about putting myself through the torture of listening to the final cut, it was that by the time I got to the following record in the segment, I think I appreciated it that much more, just because what came before it was so absolutely terrible. Does it sound like a Pink Floyd record? Yes and no. It has qualities of a Pink Floyd record. His lead guitar and his voice, Gilmour that being, coming back to the forefront, certainly give it more of a Floyd quality than either the Wall or the final cut, in my opinion. But it's obvious that Richard Wright wasn't drafted in until the very last moment, and so what his exact contributions to the album are, who knows. Same with Nick Mason. Apparently his chops were really out of shape at that point, and there's all kinds of discussion about that online and whatever. And that's, I think, why they did the remixed and updated version for the later years, which, don't worry, we'll get to that. That'll be probably the last episode in the series when we get to the later years box set and talk about the rejiggered momentary lapse of reason and whatever else is in there. But yeah, I really like it. I think it's a good album. I enjoy listening to it. I think the songwriting is great. I think the final track, Sorrow, is one of the best tracks on the album. I think having Tony Levin on bass makes a big impact. He's just, well, he's a far more accomplished bassist than Roger, that's for sure, and even more than Gilmour, even though Gilmour obviously contributed to some of the best and most interesting bass lines from the classic albums. I mean, all the fretless stuff on Hey You and the bass line on Pigs, like that's obviously Gilmour. It doesn't even sound like Roger has the technical capability of playing something like that. You can tell just by the phrasing of it that it's Gilmour, even without knowing that. Yeah, but Tony Levin's bass on it is great. The drums, which how much of it is Nick Mason, I have no idea. Both Jim Keltner and Carmine Appice are credited in the list of musicians. Both phenomenal drummers. Is it a true Pink Floyd album? Probably not, but I really like it. I think it sounds great. I enjoy it. I enjoy the songs on it a lot. I really can't find any fault with it, any songs on it that I don't like or wouldn't go back to. And again, the lyrics, Roger saying Gilmour's lyrics are pale in comparison to his own, is absolute bullshit. The lyrics to Learning to Fly, which he co-wrote, are just gorgeous. What an uplifting and beautiful track that is. All of the sentiments that Roger tried to express on the final cut and on the wall can be summarized neatly by The Dogs of War. Yes, very simple song, not going deep there, but it's actually pleasant to listen to. One Slip, love the lyrics on that. Love the poetic quality of it, but it's still a love song. On the Turning Away, very nice. Not preachy, just very open and vulnerable kind of lyric to that. I Like a New Machine Part 1 and Part 2. I love Yet Another Movie. And the standout track on the album for me is certainly Sorrow. I enjoy Sorrow a lot, and I think that that's one of their crowning achievements. We'll leave that in. Let me take care of my cat here for a moment. We'll be back in a sec. All right. Cat noises may continue. We shall see. Yeah, I like A Momentary Lapse of Reason. I think it's a good album. I enjoy it a lot. I haven't listened to the remix since I first heard it when it came out all those years ago. So I'm not going to comment on that now. I'll just save it till I get to that part of the series and discuss the later years and see what I think of it then. But I remember it being pretty good. Not necessarily preferring it to the original, but thinking that it's an interesting way to hear the album, and it does remove some of the 80s quality to it, but that doesn't particularly bother me. At least I don't remember it bothering me at the time. But we'll save the rest of that discussion for later in this series. And now let's move on to the final one. We're not going to talk about the Endless River here. We'll talk about The Division Bell, which I consider the last Floyd album. And this is probably the closest thing to a Floyd album since Animals, maybe even Wish You Were Here. You get Richard Wright actually fully integrated into the writing and recording process this time. He even gets a lead vocal spot on Wearing the Inside Out, which is it's a very profound lyric. He didn't write it. Anthony Moore wrote the lyric for him, but a very profound lyric about being silent for a long time and then finally being allowed to speak again. And I think his contributions to the writing on Marooned and Cluster 1 and things like that, and Keep Talking, I think it shows. I think you hear what had been missing from the previous 4 albums with those contributions there. So I really enjoy The Division Bell as well. I think it's a great album. I love the cover artwork. I love the whole theme of communication. I also like that the words have a sharpness to them, thanks to Polly Sampson, and in some cases, I guess, Nick Laird Close. Hopefully I'm saying his name right. But I think it's very clear who the intended target is on songs like Poles Apart and the end of Lost for Words. And you know what? More power to them, because they deserve to trash him. They really do. They really do. Especially now. Every word demonstrably true. Yeah, damn right. You can tell whose side of the debate I'm on. I like it. I like The Division Bell a lot. I think it's a great record, and I think it holds up. And it's probably the closest to 5th place on my list after Animals over any of the other albums. Maybe 6th. I feel like Piper at the Gates of Dawn is also significant enough to be on there. But I prefer A Momentary Lapse of Reason and The Division Bell over The Wall and the Final Cut. I think they're both better records. They're both more enjoyable to listen to. I think the lyrics are great. Yes, that's right. I said I think they're great lyrics. I don't think talking about politics makes your lyrics good or even profound, Mr. Waters. Yeah, I should probably stop there. But okay, so let's summarize. We've been through all 14 albums. What are the ones that are absolutely essential to check out? Well, for sure, Piper and Saucerful for the early period. I would highly recommend you check out Ummagumma and Atom Heart Mother, but the next one after Piper and Saucerful that's absolutely essential is Metal, for sure. Metal, Dark Side, Wish You Were Here. Animals, that's 6, and I think those are probably the most classic records. And after that, if you want to explore the later period, people are going to disagree with me, and that's okay. They're going to be, really? You're not going to put The Wall in that list? And no, I'm not. I'm not going to put The Wall in the list. I'm going to say either Momentary Lapse of Reason or The Division Bell would be your seventh train stop. I prefer The Division Bell over the two of them, just because it sounds closer to an authentic Pink Floyd record. Yeah, those are my thoughts on it. It was fun to go through all of them again, except the Final Cut, and hear some of the stuff that I had not paid attention to in quite some time. So overall, is Floyd a band whose entire catalog is worth exploring? Well, obviously I think so, otherwise I wouldn't be doing it. Aside from the Final Cut, every single album has something unique to offer and tells an interesting chapter of their overall history. So is it essential as listening to all their records as it is either of the other 2 deep dives I've done on this series, the Beatles and King Crimson? For me, not necessarily, because once they really find their sound with Metal and Dark Side of the Moon, that's the sound they're known and loved for. And so I do think the 4 albums that I mentioned at the start are the best indicators of that sound and the best balanced group sounding records that they did. But hearing the entire story is interesting, and like I said, I really enjoy the final 2 albums. I think they're both still really great records with a lot of great music on them that are worth listening to. Do they sound like Pink Floyd records of the classic period? No, they don't. Division Bell is the closest of the 2, but no, they don't sound like classic Pink Floyd records to me. They're still great records, though. So that's my list of the 7 you should check out, which is half the catalog. Piper, Saucerful, Metal, Dark Side, Wish You Were Here, Animals, and the Division Bell. Those are the 7 that I enjoy the most, with the 4, Metal, Dark Side, Wish You Were Here, and Animals being, like, for me, the quintessential Floyd. Those are my thoughts on it. I'm excited to see the comments on this one. I bet I'm going to upset a lot of people, particularly with my comments about Mr. Waters, but you know what? I really don't care. The point of this channel is for me to say what I think, and if you think I'm wrong, then by all means, please argue with me. Tell me what my blind spots are. Tell me why I'm being a jerk and I'm not being considerate, or just tell me you enjoy it and I don't, and we just have a difference of opinions. We can agree to disagree. That's fine, but I felt I would be honest with this, because with all the crap in the media that's going on about the dispute between Gilmour and Waters' defamation lawsuit, I just figured I'd weigh in and be honest about what I think. I'm not going to talk about his political opinions that have inspired the defamation lawsuit. I'm going to leave that out of it. I'm just going to say I think he's an arrogant, stuck-up bastard, and he really needs to put himself in check. Gilmour comes across as the more likable party right now, even if behind the scenes he's really the one being the antagonist. I don't think he is, but it's easier to believe that he's not, because he comes across as more likable right now. And the fact that this feud exists between the 2 of them and is perhaps tainting the legacy of Pink Floyd is a real shame, because in their golden period between 71 and 77, they really did both contribute some amazing stuff to the band, and it's still some of the best sounding and most classic rock music that's out there. And so the fact that there's just this big public dispute between the 2 of them is really a shame, but I'm not going to pick sides in particular here. I still think Pink Floyd is a great band. I hope that this public defamation does not take away any of the importance of the work that they did together. those are my thoughts. Please let me know in your comments. Do you agree with my 7 picks? Which one is your favorite? Which ones would you recommend? Do you think I'm totally wrong about Roger and about the final cut? If so, by all means, say what you think. I may not agree with you, but this is an open platform, so say what you want. And well, I just want to see engagement. So I just hope you say something rather than nothing, even if I disagree with that something. That's all for now. Have a great rest of your Sunday, and thanks for watching. Bye.